Welcome. Thank you all for coming. Fareed, thank you for joining us all at the Y.
I should say to begin, if I may, thank you to the Y and thank you to Malcolm. When we were trying to think up who we could get to do this, my editor, Drake McFeely, said, well, you know, ideally it would be somebody who kind of sells more books than you. So I said, well, as it happens, I have somebody who I know, who I've known for 30 years, whom nobody sells more books than, so we're in good shape.
Well, Fareed, yet. You're the one with
That's
a
right.
fabulous new book out, so all this could change overnight. I want to push our discussion of the book back a little and spend the first part of our conversation talking a little more about you. And I thought a good way to jump off would be to recite one of my favorite ditties, which dates from the 1950s, and it was something that the kind of hard right McCarthyites of the 50s used to say. I'm sure you know this one. When eras die, their legacies are left to strange police. The professors of New England guard the glories that were Greece. And I've always loved that, even though, of course, it was McCarthyites who came up with it. But there's a couple of ideas in there that I'd like you to respond to. The first is, you've just written a work of history. Is it appropriate to think of the historian as a policeman? That's one of the intriguing things about that. Are you a guardian of, how do you see your role as a historian? And what does it mean to think of a historian as a policeman?
I think that's a fascinating question. I did know the ditty. I never thought very much about it. I have always thought that the function of a historian or somebody interested in historical analysis is to make it shed light on the present. You don't study history the way you study Shakespeare because of its innate beauty or its ability to shed light on the deepest recesses of our soul. You study history because you're trying to understand what is happening in the world. You know, we in social science, broadly construed, unlike in the real sciences, you can't do an experiment. You can't say, let me try to figure out what a world with only 2 great powers looks like, and then I'm going to try out a world with 4 great powers, right? So all you have is historical eras where things happened, and you can say to yourself, oh, we're in a revolutionary era now. What did they look like in the past? So I think of myself as really consciously trying to take that past and apply it to the present. And you're right, to a certain extent, you're a policeman because you're trying to ensure that people don't do bad history, you know? And the worst kind of history, I think, tends to be history as nostalgia. You know, the idea that there was this Edenic past that we have slipped away from, and that takes a very powerful hold on people. You talked about the ancient Greeks. From the time of the ancient Greeks, there has been this kind of nostalgia and a desire for a return to the good old days. Many of Horace's poems are about, oh tempora, oh mores, we've lost our way, and if only we could go back and to the time when Greece or Rome was great, and then politicians telling you, I'm going to take you back to make Greece great again, right? This is a very long tradition in Western history.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting thing about that little ditty is it points out something that's sort of obvious but worth commenting more, which is it's really weird to think of the fact that we're getting ancient Greece through the eyes of professors in New England, right? It's a particular demographic subset is governing our view of this hugely important. It's this reminder that who the historian is a tremendously important factor to consider in evaluating their history. So who is the historian Fareed Zakaria? Give us a little kind of insight into what you're bringing to the table as a historian of this.
So first, to just reinforce your point, the whole idea of ancient Greece as this paradise was a Victorian invention. The British decided in the 19th century that the greats were classical Greece and Republican Rome, and that was worth studying and emulating, and that was a kind of story. But before that, nobody had really thought of it quite that way. So you're absolutely right. Now, who am I in all of this? I think I probably come to it with a greater sense of an appreciation, if you will, for progress than people nowadays do, and that probably has something to do with the fact that I grew up in India. So in the United States, there is, increasingly we complexify what has happened in the past in the West in the last 400 or 500 years. We see the untold stories, the victims' the point of view, which is all entirely understandable and appropriate, and it's a way of expanding the narrative, expanding our historical understanding. But I grew up in a very poor country. The India I left had a per capita income of $300. The United States, to give you some comparison, now is $72,000 per capita income. If you went into the villages in India, and my father was a politician, so I spent a lot of time with him kind of campaigning in villages, what you were looking at was medieval poverty. And so for me, the ability of societies to move out of that through the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the creation of modern liberal democratic states is an extraordinary transforming story. And I am still somewhat dazzled by that journey. I'm not. It's not that I don't understand the complexities and the complexifying and pointing out the people who were left out or the stories that weren't told, but I'm still a little dazzled by that extraordinary achievement of human beings after thousands of years of completely flat average income to have this extraordinary rise in the last 300 years.
Where in India what part of India did you grow up in?
I grew up in Bombay, which is now called Mumbai, and my father, it was the old British system, so my father was was given a constituency. So the constituency was out in a small town called Aurangabad, but that town itself was only 30% of the constituency, and the surrounding 1,000 villages were so there was a lot of time going around places, and as I say, you're seeing.
And you traveled with him.
Yeah, we didn't. When I grew up, I don't know whether this was India, whether this was generational, whether this was my family, but you know how when you raise kids nowadays, and I say this to a new parent, we kind of get down at the kids level. We go to Disneyland. When I was a kid, that would have been unheard of for my parents, I remember attending, I still remember this vividly. My father was at the time tourism minister of the state of Maharashtra, attending a 4-day conference on how to revive tourism in Aurangabad, his capital, and taking notes and finding it all quite interesting.
Wait, how old were you?
I was 8 years old at the time, I realized. And that was sort of like a metaphor for my life, which is, if I had a school break and my dad was on a campaign tour, but guess what? We weren't going to Aspen to ski. We were going on wherever he was going. So, we were part of his movie and my parents' movie much more than they ever were. And they were wonderful parents and they allowed us all that. But that was, my life was very much being part of their life rather than, so the movies we saw, the music, the idea that we would all go to see a Disney cartoon was unimaginable. No, we would go and see, Lawrence of Arabia, and at whatever age I was, and half understand it, half not.
How would you describe the kind of worldview you inherited from your parents? Did you inherit a worldview from your parents?
Inevitably, I think one does. I think the one that I probably inherited most strongly was a deep commitment to the kind of founding idea of India, which was secular liberal democracy. my father was my father was a Muslim, and our parents were Muslim, and so growing up in India, the child of a Muslim politician was a particular experience, right? Muslims are a minority in India, 10 to 12%. My father once said to me, the most important political decision he made when he was 10 or 12 years old. As a young Muslim kid in India in the 20s and 30s, I guess this was in the 30s, he had to choose between two alternate visions for his future. Nehru's vision and Gandhi's vision of a secular democracy, or Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan's vision of a state run on the grounds of religious nationalism. And he chose India. So to the extent there was a worldview, there was a great pride in that idea and the idea of India as a secular democracy. Beyond that, I think there was just, there was a lot of conversation about politics and economics. My mother was a journalist, my father was a politician. And the dinner table was, what should my mother put on the cover that week? She was one of the senior editors, and it was a free-for-all. They were very good about letting us chime in and say, no, this is all wrong. You shouldn't do this, and that was exhilarating. But I don't think for example, my father was like every Indian of his generation, I would say, basically a kind of socialist. And I certainly didn't inherit that. In fact, I rebelled against that.
Mm-hmm. How much experience did you have with the rest of the world growing up?
Very little personally. I went on one trip to Europe and one trip to the United States.
How old were you when you went to those two places?
10 or 11 when I went to Europe, and 13 or 14 when I went to America.
And when you went to America, what was that? Tell me about that trip.
Oh, it was, the weird thing is that you guys think of the 70s as this horrible period of malaise and gas lines. And for me, it was like the promised land, coming to America. The television, the escalators. I remember being very dazzled by escalators at the time. Going to LA and the wide open spaces and the cars.
Where did you go on this trip?
Went to New York. We went to Princeton. Again, speaking of being part of my father's movie, my father was very interested in, Islamic history. And so part of my vacation trip to America was we went to Princeton to have lunch with Bernard Lewis, the famous historian of Islam who lived in Princeton.
Your dad just called him up and said...
My dad had written a bunch of stuff as well, and so wrote. In those days, you faxed, I think. Yeah. Remember those things, the fax machines? And he was lovely. He took us to the faculty. I still remember it vividly. He took us to the faculty club in Princeton and gave us lunch. And then we went to Boston, and then we went to LA. That was it. And
how long were you over here? Sorry, I'm now captivated.
2.5 weeks. No, it was, look, you're absolutely right. So the first time I went to Europe, I remember the thing that dazzled me in Italy, of all places, was the Coke machines. The idea that, you have to remember, India in those days, as I say, was very poor. And so, that was the kind of thing to a kid that was absolutely dazzling. But I was always fascinated by America, and I loved, even then, old American movies. And I remember dragging my brother, who was not particularly interested, because I found in New York at a revival house, who knows where, probably the Film Forum or something, Casablanca was playing. And I was like, we have to see this. This is supposed to be the greatest movie that Hollywood ever made. And we walked in, and I was totally dazzled by it. So,
what's funny?
Still my favorite movie. About a few years ago, my son is in the audience. He can attest to this. For my birthday, my kids asked me, what would you like as a birthday present? I said, I would like you, please, to watch Casablanca from start to finish without looking at your phones. And they did, and they liked it.
What's funny? Hear you tell a story. So I was in the same era growing up in Canada, in Ontario, and my father, a math professor, all of his grad students, every single one of them was Indian, South Indian. They're all. Wow. So I grew up, and all they would do is hang out at our house. So we fed them. And so I grew up surrounded by Indian. I probably had eaten more Indian food by the time I was 16 than any other non-Indian in Canada. My mother wore a sari
That's
because
fascinating.
they would come with gifts.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
and each one of them, of course, what I didn't understand at the time was that India had many, many millions of people, and the graduate students who got out
Yes.
were like the best. The denominator was a billion.
Yes.
So you were getting 1 in a billion.
It's-
I thought that all Indians were, had IQs of 180, because everyone that...
This is one of the most common misconceptions that I always tell people. Please understand, Indians are not good at math. Of the 1.4 billion, the ones who are good at math test well enough that they get to the United States.
But you see, we had reverse fantasies here. I had a fantasy about India. It was full of these glamour, and they were all
Wait,
men.
what was the glamour of India? Because they must have been all poor. They were eating at your house because they couldn't afford
They had no
groceries.
money, but no. They had impeccable manners. They were all, I don't know why, and maybe this is just my childhood, they all seemed to be incredibly handsome. And they, midway through their time getting PhDs with my father, a wife would be sent from India.
Yes.
Who would invariably already have a PhD, right? And she would be insanely glamorous. And we would go over every Saturday night to some little apartment near the university, and we would be served some curry and something by some like fabulous, exotic. It was like, I was like 7. I was like, oh my goodness, this is like amazing.
It is actually very telling what you're describing, because what you're describing is one of the consequences of British colonialism, which was that there was this elite in India, 10% of the public maybe, urban upper middle class elite that was not very rich because it was a poor country. So even if you were upper middle class in Bombay or Calcutta or Madras, you were not very rich, but you were educated, and you were educated in English. And so when people would meet people like that in the West, they would be like, oh my God, I can't tell you how many times I've met people, even now, but certainly 20 years ago, would say, I went to India, it's amazing, and everybody speaks English. And it's like, no. It tells you what India you saw. 10% of Indians speak English. 950 million do not. But you were in Bombay and Delhi, and you were at the fancy hotels, and you were talking to people who were, like that.
Where were you? So what school did you go to growing up?
I went to the Cathedral and John Connon School, which was founded by the Anglo-Scottish Presbyterians in 1850, I think. And we would begin every day with a hymn taken from the Church of England's hymnal. We would then do a prayer from the Book of Common Prayer. Then we would do the Lord's Prayer. So imagine, 800 Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, with the occasional Christian sprinkled in, joyfully singing, Nearer, my God, to thee. Or when I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died. I still remember all the songs.
So another commonality. This is the world that my mother grew up in Jamaica.
Right.
She went to one of these English schools. Now in Jamaica, it's slightly different because it's for expats, half expats, half.
But it was Anglican.
They sang the same hymns. She could, to this day, will recite and the same kind of prayers and whole 9 yards. Did this turn you into an Anglophile?
I think, at some level, an Anglophone. I'm very comfortable with that world. There are things about England and English culture that I absolutely love, including, by the way, the church music. I think that is England's great contribution to classical music. They have no Mozarts or anything like that, but they have a really wonderful tradition of this church music. I'm very familiar and love English literature as a result. I know a lot about English political history. But I would say that I was always more dazzled and attracted to America. Mm-hmm. Because there's a thing about the British, and particularly as an Indian, you can't help always be aware of it, which is that there's I think enormous great things to say about English liberalism and Locke, Mills, Johnson. But there was always, at least in the experience of it, a racism attached to it, which was, this is not available to Indians, by the way, because they were ruling over us, So you could be fascinated and attracted to the ideals and the ideas, but you always knew that there was almost inherent within it an idea that there was a first-class citizen and a second-class citizen, So you could read John Locke, but then you would go to the club where until 20 years ago, when I was growing up in India in the 60s, there would have been a sign that said, "No Indians and dogs, enter that club." So that was always something you were aware of, whereas America felt to me like it had all the pluses of that stuff, but it was wide open to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that feeling you had about America was naive or accurate?
No, I think it's basically broadly accurate in large historical comparative terms, by which I mean, is the United States been, the best country in the world to people? No, but compared with most other countries, it's been extraordinarily welcoming to outsiders. I'd say with the one exception is the African-American experience. I think that's one of the hard things to talk about when we talk about race in America, because America is this peculiar thing. It was unusually harsh and punitive to African Americans, but it was unusually open and receptive to immigrants of other backgrounds. And so, when people, that's why I sometimes feel like this whole discussion of people of color, and you're mixing together very, very different experiences.
So you come to America to go to Yale. Mm-hmm. And how old are you at that point?
18.
18. Describe to me 18-year-old Fareed. So describe to me, as you step on the plane to come to America, tell me, who are you? How do you describe yourself? What are you excited about?
I was very excited to come to Yale because I did not have a great time in high school, particularly the end of high school. I was sort of, I was something of a nerd. I was okay. I was pretty good at sports, but that was not my passion. I was fine. What I really loved was writing, humanities, debating. We used to have a thing called elocution, where you had to recite poetry, which I was very good at. It was something I can still remember the poems. And I was sort of I would say honestly, a bit of a misfit in my school, because everybody in school I was wanted to be an engineer or a doctor. And if you were smart, they was sort of assumed that was what you wanted to do. And the way you got into universities in India was they literally only looked at 3 scores if you were going into engineering or medicine. So if you passed the big, our equivalent of the A levels, people would say to you, what's your PCM? Physics, chemistry, math. What were your physics, chemistry, math scores? And if you were applying to med school, they'd say, what were your PCBs? Physics, chemistry, biology. That's all they cared. Those were the only subjects that mattered. And for me, I like to read Dickens for pleasure. I sort of hoped that I'd find people in America who were like me. And for me, Yale was like a complete intellectual homecoming. I just absolutely fell in love with it. I thought it was a completely magical place. I think that some of that had to do with Yale, but a lot of it just had to do with coming to a place where other people were reading Dickens for pleasure.
Well, my question is not how you felt about it once you got there, but how you felt before you got there. I mean, you're making a massive leap here, culturally. Were you apprehensive?
It seems like that, but I don't remember that at the time. I was very excited. I wasn't apprehensive. I would know, and part of it was I had gone before, so it wasn't a complete unknown. No, I was excited, and I never had any culture shock. People, and again, this is going to seem my naive immigrant's patriotism, but Americans were incredibly nice to me from the day
Have you rewritten the history of your teenage self? This sounds
No. I told you my teenage self in India was I was not happy. I was not that. I was definitely one of those kids for whom high school was an awkward experience.
How many other Indians were there at Yale when you went there?
2. Yeah.
And they were, describe them.
One of them was from my school, and I didn't like him, so we didn't talk. And the other one was somebody from Delhi. I didn't hang out with them. I
This is
hung
like,
out.
you know, this is like the story
I was
of-
assimilating. I was hanging out with the white kids.
This is like the, we'll get to that. This is like the story of, they discovered, you know, every now and again they discover these languages, these lost languages, and they discovered one where only 2 people still spoke it, but they didn't like each other. So,
So it was an awkward conversation.
wait, you said, and we glossed over it, but we shouldn't. You were too busy assimilating. Tell me about that.
Yeah, you know, I honestly came to America, and I think one has, you know, depends on one's personality. I think you either you resist or you sort of try to fit in. And I think I'm more of a try to fit in kind of person. My son will always say to me when I go back to India, I suddenly start talking like an Indian, you know, and I think that's probably true because I want to fit back in, you know, and I think there was a part of me that wanted to fit in, and you know, even intellectually, I took a lot of classes in American history. One of the classes I took that I loved was, we used to call it Tuesday afternoon at the movies, but it was a class taught by Annette Insdorf, very distinguished professor who teaches now at Columbia. And it was classics of American movies. And it was kind of my way of assimilating into the country. And it was great. We saw Scarface, the original Scarface. We saw all the Frank Capra movies, the Lubitsch movies, the William Wyler movies. It was fantastic.
Did you feel like when someone is in that position, there's a lot of catching up.
Yeah, I felt like I had a lot of catching up. You know, it was a kind of fun catching up. I remember when I was a grad student, I would watch All in the Family reruns on TV, and I was like, I need to understand this. You know, this was a seminal.
My version of that was when we never had a television, so and it was sort of shameful for me.
But you must have known a lot about American culture.
Well, no. I was making a slightly different point, which is, so in high school, I got really good at faking it. So I could talk about Happy Days all day long. I didn't even know what Happy Days was like on the screen, but I had many thoughts. Football, I'd never seen a football game, but I won the betting pool.
No.
At high school. Because I studied, got the newspaper and studied the scores and the statistics. I had no idea what football was like to play.
But that's not faking it. That's like...
That's catching up. It's a version of catching up. There's something kind of honorable in that. I want to go back a little bit, but later you would go, we'll get to your book. But I feel like this is all a way.
I'm having fun.
No. I mean, there's a reason I'm doing this, which is I feel like it's much easier to fall in love with the book if you know a little bit more about you and where you're coming from. Mm-hmm. Because there is in the book this lovely tone of enthusiasm and optimism about the experiment, the American experiment in the end, but also many other experiments along the way. Mm-hmm. And so I feel this is what I'm trying to.
No, and you're right. That's why I say that's like. I think it's amazing what we've been able to do in the last 200 or 300 years. You know, I think that, and I've seen in a weird sense what it was like before by being in rural India, you know, in the 60s and 70s.
So you don't. Like this is a kind of a dumb question, but were you second generation? Had it been your parents who came here, this book doesn't happen, does it?
I think it's a different. No, absolutely, it's a different book. I think there's a big difference between the immigrant experience and the first generation experience. I think that's very true. Not that one is better than the other, but the immigrant, you know, first of all, is much more really has a foot in both cultures and knows. But you know, so I have all that stuff about European history and American history, but I can do a whole thing about Indian history because I grew up with that. That was the history I grew up with. And the other part is you're always at some level subconsciously comparing. Mm-hmm. You know, whereas an Indian American is not comparing. They have grown up and not just in a country, but in the richest country in the history of the world. Mm-hmm. That's even just thinking of it that way is a comparative perspective. You know, I think of America as the richest country in the history of the world. An American who grew up here won't think of that. They just think of it as home. Yeah.
Makes me think, should we ban non-immigrants from writing history? No, I mean, I'm sort of being semi-serious in the sense that, you know, if you look at the the contributions that immigrants have made to any culture, but particularly the United States, are so massively disproportionate to their numbers that at a certain point you have to think, oh, maybe the best way to experience America is to come to America and not be born here.
Well, so I'll tell you a funny story, which is entirely true. For my 3 books ago, Post-American World, this was a period when Fox News, if you can believe this, had not completely gone crazy. So Sean Hannity had a weekend show, not the regular show that he has, which I don't know if he had or didn't have, but there was a weekend show where he often did books and he often did an author. And he tapes with me. And, the title is The Post-American World, but the first line is, this is not a book about the decline of America, but rather the rise of everyone else. So that just gives you a sense of the tone of the book, and it's very optimistic about America. He obviously had not read the book, and so he kept fixating on the title. He was like, Post-American World. I just got to ask you, do you love America? And so finally I said to him, Sean, let me point something out to you. I am an American by choice. I came here, moved myself, left my old country, my culture, my family behind to become an American. You are an American by accident of birth. He edited that out of the interview.
One other question I wanted, how has your relationship changed to India? So in the time that you have been here in America, your country of origin has undergone an astonishing transformation. And I'm just curious, what happens to you when you go back? And you're checking in on India.
Right.
I assume you've checked in on India on a regular basis over the last 30 years. What has that been like?
Oh, it's been fascinating. So to begin with, and you're right, because I go back to see my mom and dad every winter. And, even when once I had kids, my kids went back. My son is 24 years old, and I think he's probably been back to India 24 times, roughly speaking, every year. For the first 10 or 15 years, it was like seeing a snapshot that just never changed. It was you're seeing a snapshot, and it's basically the same. And then you start to see the economic reforms of the 1990s, and suddenly you start to see India is transforming itself, and it's just things that you'd never thought. In a weird way, I associated India with certain kinds of poverty and backwardness and lack of access to certain kinds of things. And all of a sudden, that's all changing. And now you're beginning to see, India is getting decoupled from poverty. And so you're beginning to see modernity, but an Indian version of modernity, which is very different from a Western version of modernity, and one that incorporates kind of India's strange, colorful, extraordinary character. And that was a thrilling journey to see. So through the 90s and the aughts, it was amazing to watch. And because, again, I have some of this access to my father's old constituency. My dad set up a charity there. There are a bunch of colleges. I still go there, and so you're seeing not just Bombay getting more like glittery and Dubai-like, but these villages. You're seeing people have scooters, and they have fax machines, and they have access to healthcare that they never had. And now, in the last 10 years, it has been a very complicated story because the economic rise continues apace, and that continues to be dazzling and thrilling. But you're also seeing the rise of Hindu nationalism. And in many ways, my father died about 15 years ago. I'm very glad he hasn't lived to see that, because in a way, his whole life's work was trying to build a secular India, an India pluralistic, which tolerated and encouraged diversity. There's no other way to put it. India has moved in a very different direction. So it's economically surging, but politically becoming more intolerant, more illiberal. And it's made me think, I wonder whether when India shed its socialist skin, I sort of was the first to celebrate because there was so much corruption and dysfunction and poverty associated with it. But now that it's shedding its secular skin, I'm beginning to wonder, was all of that, the socialism, the secularism, the liberalism, was that all basically a kind of veneer borrowed from the West? Mm-hmm. You know, in the book I quote Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, who says to Galbraith, the American ambassador, he says, "I may be the last Englishman to rule India." And Nehru was educated at Harrow and Cambridge and came from a very aristocratic Indian family where they spoke English from the time they were born. And there is something to that India is in a way returning to a more, perhaps more authentic place. Perhaps, this is a phase, this kind of Hindu nationalism. I hope it isn't. I hope it isn't the most authentic version of India, because I always think of India, and Hinduism in particular, as being incredibly tolerant. I mean, Hinduism is one of the most extraordinary religions in the world in that almost nothing is prescribed. You can be vegetarian and be a good Hindu. You can be non-vegetarian and be a good Hindu. You can believe in one God. You can believe in 300 million. I mean, you can also not believe in God and be a Hindu. I mean, there's this wonderful...
Big tent.
Yeah, it's a huge tent, and it's very absorptive. Buddhism started in India, but there are no Buddhists in India. Why? Because Hinduism just absorbed it. It said, you want to be nonviolent? Great, be nonviolent. You want to be vegetarian? You want to meditate? We believe in all that, So it's this wonderfully absorptive religion. And it doesn't feel to me like intolerance is part of its DNA.
Do you feel uncomfortable when you go back now?
There are times at which I feel uncomfortable, only because of this. Otherwise, I feel incredibly comfortable. I mean, because I've been back a lot, I still speak the language, all that. But this piece of it is very awkward.
Mm-hmm.
It's because there's a little bit of a kind of people don't talk about it. In polite society, when people are talking about growth is great, GDP numbers look amazing, this, that, and the other. You just don't mention, there's this other small issue which is, just left untalked about.
Yeah. What is it? This is we really should talk about the book. But this is.
If you're going to say tangential question, I think.
No, but I'm really, this whole idea of a country where there is a significant, not a center of gravity, but a significant portion of the country's intellectual energy and cultural energy lies outside its borders. So there's a series of countries like that around the world. Jamaica is one of those.
Nigeria,
Jamaica, Israel, India, South Korea.
Yeah.
And whereas in the United States, it's not true at all. It's the energies. And I'm just curious, is this model of having kind of, it's a model of having two centers of gravity. Is that ultimately a better model for succeeding in the modern world? What do you think about that?
I think it certainly has helped India. People often talk about brain drain. I think that gets it completely backwards, because one of the things that opened India up was the experience of Indian Americans outside India. Because in a weird way, you had a controlled experiment. You were like seeing how Indians around the world were doing in different forms of government. There's this funny member of parliament in India in the 1960s who was a member of one of the few economically liberal, kind of capitalist-oriented parties. And he asked a question in Prime Minister's question hour to Indira Gandhi, who was then Prime Minister. He said, "Madam Prime Minister, can I ask you to reflect on the fact that Indians everywhere in the world, under every form of government, seem to prosper except under yours? What do you make of that paradox?" But there's some truth to that, which is sort of like you ask yourself, well, if Indians do well in Southeast Asia, in Britain, in America, in Kenya, why are they not doing well in India? And that sort of, gets at this.
Wait, what did she say?
I know it's a famous question. Nobody knows what the. I don't know if it, like one of these stories that we say in journalism. It's too good to check. I've never actually checked whether or not he actually said this.
All Canada. We had question period as well in Canada, and obviously in England. It is the nature of question period that the questions are always much more interesting than the answers. Exactly. Nobody cares about the answers.
Exactly. I would refer the honourable gentleman to the report number so and so. But I think that it infuses energy into an otherwise stagnant society, and it makes people realize that it's not our DNA, it's not our genetics. You can do well. And look, at the end of the day, if you believe, as I know you do, Malcolm, that talent is roughly speaking sprinkled pretty evenly throughout the world. The problem in India is not that a few 100,000 people have come to America and done well. The problem is in places like India, there are still millions and millions of highly talented people who do not have the opportunities and the social and political and economic structures that allow them to succeed. There's more than enough people in India. The fact that you lost a few 100,000 or even a few million to Western countries, that's not the problem. There's more than enough talent in India.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the book, at long last. I was curious.
See, you're just forcing people to buy the book to read it.
Yes.
You're not getting the...
No, because, but I was curious, you say that this was a book that you embarked upon, or at least got the idea for 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what changed in those 10 years. In other words, if I had asked you, if we were having this conversation about the book you intended to write in 2014, well, how would the way you describe it be different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So about 10 years ago, I began to notice that politics was taking on a kind of strange form in America. The Tea Party was taking over the Republican Party. And the more you examine the Tea Party, and Theda Skocpol, a scholar at Yale, did very good work on this, you realize it was fundamentally, even though they talked about economics and budgets a lot, it was a racial reaction to the election of the first black president. It was, the core concerns were immigration, multiculturalism, things like that. And somehow this caught on like fire in the Republican Party. Or the fact that Obama was presiding over, was without any question the strongest economic recovery from the global financial crisis of any major country in the world, and yet his approval ratings were just not budging. The stock market tripled under Barack Obama's presidency, and his approval ratings basically stayed the same. There was something going on where that used to be a very clear connection between health of the economy, approval ratings of the president. And so I was like, something is going on here. And I remember either reading or having Blair on my program. Tony Blair was very thoughtful about these issues. And he was talking about how the old left-right divide is breaking down. And so that's where it began from. And I think the truth is I wrote the book to educate myself about it. So I don't, I think that I caught on to a trend, and the fact that it took me 10 years was, partly because I did write 2 books in the middle, but I was trying to educate myself. And, if I'm going to understand previous periods of revolution and upheaval, I need to kind of go back to the French Revolution. I need to go back to the Industrial Revolution. And it took me a while to get comfortable that I knew enough to speak with authority about those things. And I kept all the while observing American politics and Western politics, and it kept getting weirder in exactly the way I was saying. So in a sense, I think I was a bit prescient in that all then snowballs into Brexit, into Trump, into Bolsonaro. But then you began to see it even with Xi Jinping in China, who is in his own way very much a populist. He's against the kind of liberalization that has taken place. Or somebody like Putin, who is very much a cultural reactionary. Modi in India, in some ways, what is the Hindutva? But again, a reaction against the decades of secularization and so there was something that I was catching which was growing. And so in a way, I kept feeling like this is really important, but I wished I could have written it faster, But it really, I felt like I have to understand this period, this history, and I have to go back and school myself in it.
Were there things that you believed in 2014 that you realized were, in retrospect, were incorrect or
Yeah, I mean, I think mostly I kept thinking this was a phase. And I was kind of writing because I was fascinated by it, but I kept thinking to myself, this has got to be a phase. You know, this is, and the crazier it got, the more I thought that. And I have to confess, I could not believe when Trump was able to take over the Republican Party, that he was able to take it over so completely, turn it essentially into a family cult. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, think about it. In the last Republican convention, there was no party platform for the first time in history. The party platform of the Republican convention is a single paragraph that says, whatever Donald Trump says is the party's platform. There was not a single former Republican presidential nominee or president invited to the convention. And yet 5 members of the Trump family were given primetime slots to speak. That's not a political party, right? I mean, that's something else. And so that part of it, I just thought, this is so weird. It's got to go away. I mean, at some level, I still think that. It's, you know, it does, and it doesn't. And every day you get fresh evidence that it's not going to go away. Look at what happened today. His company, Truth Social, goes public, right? It is now an $8 billion company. Its revenues are $3.3 million. That gives it a price-to-sales ratio of 2,000. Do you know what a similar company like Reddit's price-to-sales ratio is? 10. You know, this is a cult. These people are, it's like, you know, Indians going to temples with their family jewels and leaving them with the gods in the hope that this is going to, you know, secure them something in the next life.
Sort of an odd analogy, but I was doing something on the opioid crisis. And if you call up people who study it closely and you ask them, what's unusual about this? They say exactly the same thing. It should have gone away by now, right? These kinds of things have happened all the time through history, but they go away, and this one's not going away, and no one really understands why it hasn't gone away. I mean, there is something, you know, there is something that has puzzled lots of people about the persistence of what seem like these highly dysfunctional spasms.
Yeah, and that's why I think, you know, that's why I call it in the book a kind of a broad cultural reaction to 30 or 40 years of kind of revolutionary change. And I think that's the best way to think of it. You know, this is a very broad subconscious reaction to 30 or 40 years of massive technological acceleration, massive globalization, massive social trends like the emancipation of women. I mean, if we think about it, that may be the most important social transformation we have experienced in our lifetimes. You know, because you go back over in history, there's some group was always at the top and oppressing somebody at the bottom, and there was white, black, brown. But the one thing that was always true was women were second-class citizens in every society that we can. And that has changed in just the last 30 or 40 years, right? So you upended something that had been true for tens of thousands of years. And I believe, and if you look at the kind of reactionary movements in politics, the real reactionary movements, Islamic fundamentalism, Christian nationalism, the ultra-Orthodox movements in Israel, the number one goal is to get women back in some way into the kitchen.
I once was, a couple years ago, went to Birmingham, actually way out in rural Alabama, to interview this retired police officer who had been a cop in Birmingham in the 60s and 70s, because I wanted to know what happened, what it was like, he was white, when Birmingham integrated its police force. So I was expecting him to give all kinds of, he goes, oh no, it's fine. I know it was, you know, it's like, so what, you got a black guy in a car. But when they started to get women in the police force, I mean, the whole interview was just him saying, oh my God, that was the end. I mean, that was when I had to get up. To your point, like.
Well, because it unsettles the, you know, if you think of the family as the base, the unit, the fundamental unit of society on which society grows, you're upending the structure of the family. Right?
Yeah. One of the, I mean, and I apologize for getting the book so late, but I was really, But there was one thing in the book I do want to talk about, which is something I've sort of thought in a kind of vague way, but your book really, the book, for those of you who don't know, it's a history of these revolutions that we are seeing in our present time. But you start your story in the 17th century, or even...
Correct, with the Dutch. Yeah.
And with the Dutch. And the chapter on the Dutch, I thought was absolutely fascinating. It's really about how deeply rooted, how extraordinarily rooted culture and... Because when you're giving this fascinating chapter on the Dutch in the 17th century, and you were like, oh my God, that's the Dutch.
Right.
They're the same.
Yes. we have a few friends who come from the Netherlands, and they're still,
It seems like both incredibly naive, but also, for me to say that, but like it's this revelation.
Yeah.
So like it's this a justification for doing history. The Dutch, it's not another country you're describing.
Right.
You're describing...
Right. And it turned out that those cultural attributes were key to their success. Now, it intersected with waves of technology and economics that helped them. But the core attributes of the Dutch, they're egalitarian. It's a decentralized country. It's a non-hierarchical culture. It's, very free thinking. That's why Protestantism takes hold there. And all of that together allows them to invent the tall ships, invent the joint stockholding companies, go out and adventure, make the land and water work in a way that no other European country had to do, because they had these vast agricultural flatlands where they could farm. All of that turns out to foster innovation and foster economic growth, and all of a sudden the Dutch, and I was surprised by this, became the richest country in Europe, which means the richest country in the world. They were Amsterdam was 4 times richer per capita than Paris by the end of the 17th century.
Yeah. I read something yesterday, this is why I wanted to bring it up, was that, which I hadn't realized, that the number 2 agricultural exporting country in the world after the United States is the Dutch.
And think about how tiny that...
What is it? How many people live in...
17 million
17
now.
million.
Yeah.
So but it's the same...
Yeah.
I mean, you kind of... They're eclipsed as the kind of world power, as you describe, but in a certain way they don't go away as a...
For 500 years now, the Dutch have been among the 10 richest countries in the world per capita, and been, ever since the UN created its human, whatever they call it, the living index, where they look into healthcare and life, things like that. The Dutch have been in the top 5.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is a country that began its revolution in the really the 1500s. So it's amazing. It's an amazing run.
How do you, when you write a history like that, the more you kind of play this game, the temptation is to go back further and further and further. Right?
Absolutely, and ask yourself, well, why the Dutch? What was going on right before that?
Yeah.
And so one of the things I look at, I try to talk about it. I try to wear the learning very lightly, but the structure of the breakup of the Roman Empire turns out to be very important, because the places that the Romans had the least control over, which were largely Northern Europe and Britain, are the ones that thrived the most, because they were decentralized and they were sort of forced to fend for themselves. So that turns out to have a lot to do with it. Why Europe rather than Asia? Because Europe has all these mountains and rivers, which mean there are these little principalities. There were 500 states in Europe in 1500, and they were constantly warring with each other. So what that meant is lots of innovation, because you're constantly competing with each other on military, technologically, economically, but even intellectually. Spinoza is banned in one country, he's allowed in another. Descartes is banned in one country, he travels to another. And that idea that the proximity of these various competing units is fundamentally why Europe rises first in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Were you tempted to go back further than
No,
that?
I was the only temptation was writing a book about revolutions, was to write a chapter on the Russian Revolution, because again, it's the revolution everybody thinks about. But it was really a replay of the French Revolution, as I say in the book. It was a top-down revolution. It failed in exactly the way that the French Revolution did. Lenin said he was consciously almost trying to reproduce the French Revolution. So, I'm always conscious. I think I don't have your gift at making any story completely compelling. I was like, I need this book to be accessible, and I need people to be able to read it on a long plane ride. If I add the Russian Revolution, it's going to be another 50 pages.
This reminds me of my favorite game, which I wanted to play with you tonight. One of my favorite games, which was, I'm going to give you 5 countries in Europe, and you have to get rid of. I want you to tell me, if you had to get rid of them one at a time, what's the order you would use, right?
So literally eliminate them from the face of the earth.
With each time you eliminate it, you're imagining. We get a thought experiment. You want the world without that country, then you take another one. I want the world without, until we're left with. So the countries are, and we're imagining them in their, as if throughout history they were in their modern form. So size-wise. So the countries are obviously England, France, Italy, Germany, and Russia. You got to lose one. Which one do you lose?
Russia, for sure.
Of course. Okay, that's easy. That's easy. Now it's hard. Lose one.
So this reminds me of one thing I'll say, which is a friend of ours who, Rick Hertzberg, who was a great writer, right for the New Yorker. Once wrote a cover story for GQ called "The Death of the Yuppie." And he was like, this is kind of a reaction to the 80s, how horrible yuppies are. And he ends it by saying, I have one request though, can we keep the food? And so when I think about this, like, I'm going to put cuisine aside from it. We're talking about, like, the world without Italian food would be deeply impoverished.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, Italy would be the next country on the list, because it's the most marginal, least consequential.
I would lose the French.
Yeah, no, it's France or Italy. France did bring us an enormous amount of rationalism. You think of the Enlightenment, you think about France, Descartes, Diderot, the encyclopedias.
If we add the Dutch to the list, which we should, if I have the Dutch and I have the English, I'm happy to lose the Italians and the French. So if I'm living in a world that is
so we have Germany, Italy, and Holland, and notice we have chosen the 3 worst cuisines in Europe.
That's right.
I can't help but notice that we are like eliminating, or maybe but there's something there, which is that the Southern Catholic hedonistic side is not what created the modern world.
Yeah, this is this sounds like a kind of trivial game, but this is precisely the kind of thought experiment that is prompted by reading your book, which is it makes you think. You realize the contributions of the various countries of the world are profoundly asymmetrical.
Yeah.
And we owe an enormous debt to this tiny little country, the Dutch. We owe an enormous debt to the English, which we are aware of that. But the English, on the grand scheme of things, is this little island off the right. The Russians, I mean,
it's the largest nation in the world. Isn't that interesting? Right? It spans even
really
now 10 time
could
zones.
We do without them. In fact, we'd be better off without them. Right? But it's part of the kind of. At the end of the day...
It's so fascinating to see the book as refracted through Malcolm Gladwell's mind. You see how if he wrote it, it would sell 10 times as many copies.
No. That's true. We should... Wait, did I say that's not true? I meant that... My goodness. That was...
That is the best Freudian slip of the night.
We should wrap up soon, but one last couple questions. I didn't take any of these questions, but I'm having too much fun. What are the things that's really fun about reading the book is I was imagining you researching it. I mean, the amount of reporting right? What was the most dumb, this is the question you get on the morning shows, but it's one of my favorites. In all of this process of understanding, you said you did this to educate yourself about this. What was the most kind of rewarding, fun, eye-opening moment in that long process of learning?
It's funny that, because it sounds like it's the one that you liked also. It was the Dutch. I mean, just thinking, like figuring out that this tiny, I always thought as you were, the English, invented the Industrial Revolution and all that. But the idea actually, that it turns out, if you read the book, you'll see the English got it all from the Dutch. And it wouldn't have happened if a Dutch, king didn't cross the channel, William of Orange, and make himself King of England. And the idea that all happened in this tiny little place that I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about for reasons that were very obscure. They figured out how to manage swamplands well with a series of water engineers and dikes and things like that.
They learned how to drain the swamp.
Yeah, literally, they did learn how to drain the swamp, exactly. The hardest, by the way, was the French Revolution. It is so complicated. Somebody is taking power every 3 weeks and killing everybody else and figuring out who's up and who's down. Saying to yourself, I will tell you this, if you do buy the book, I have given you in 30 pages the French Revolution. I have read, you don't have to read anything else. This is the...
We will close on, I would like that you just alluded to, but I want you to tell us the story properly, and we'll close on this. This story of how a Dutchman takes over. I somehow... I'm an Englishman. I was born in England. I was steeped on it. For some reason, this little bit of absolutely essential history, maybe it's not surprising the English don't stress the fact that they owe it all to the Dutch. But tell us the story of William of Orange's journey from...
So it begins with the Dutch the Dutch experiment, the Dutch side of flowering is cut short because at some point they become so rich that the French, the King of France realizes it and invades. And the only way they can basically stop the invasion is they open up the floodgates. That's where the freight comes from. They flood the entire kingdom, ruining something like 60 or 70% of their arable land, but staving off the French. The French, at this point, dominate and decide they're going to allow... The person they're going to allow to rule is William of Orange because he's the most conservative of all the people on the Dutch political spectrum, which is true, but he is the most liberal in Europe, even though he's the most conservative because, the Netherlands at that point is really the fountain of liberalism in Europe. And meanwhile, the British are having one of these very complicated sectarian wars between whether to become Catholic or Protestant, whether James I is going to be allowed to reign. And a group of English aristocrats decides, let's solve this very simply by inviting William of Orange to take over. Basically, the British king had a son who was Catholic, and they were trying to forestall Britain becoming Catholic. So they invite these aristocrats, they invite William of Orange to come and become King of England. Now, this was a gamble because he was going to arrive with a tiny army, not sufficient to conquer, but he's able to co-opt the elites one after the other. Very British, they don't want to fight. They decide, and the merchant elites decide, we'll be better off with the Protestant king anyway. And so he takes over and he becomes the King of England, William and Mary. And he brings with him all these Dutch ideas, practices like the joint stock company. The Dutch East India Company was the first multinational corporation in the world, really the first corporation in the world, becomes the richest corporation in the world. The English then model the British East India Company on that, which then becomes the richest company in the world. And the British economic experiment essentially is a copy of the Dutch one. And what's interesting there is it really could have gone two ways because the Catholics in Britain saw as their role model the King of France. Vast, centralized, rationalized apparatus, no decentralization, no market economy, the state owns everything. So it really was one of these hinges of history where if William of Orange had met an army in England that said, get the hell out of here, and he had gotten panicked and gone back, Britain would look more like France and would have been a vast continental empire. But the food might have been good.
The food might have been, yeah. Fareed, thank you so much. This has been delightful. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.